431 BC was the start of one of the bloodiest wars in human history. Lasting 27 years, it pitted former allies against each other, did away with rules and traditions, and decimated much of the Greek-speaking world. Today, this conflict is known as the Peloponnesian War. The war was more than a battle between empires. It was a battle between ways of life. Sparta, with its invincible army, a conservative oligarchy suspicious of anything foreign, versus Athens and its unmatched navy, a liberal democracy that loved art and literature. These opposing ideologies were bound to collide, especially when Athenians grew obsessed with spreading their way of life. Throughout Greek history, wars were usually settled in a day. Two armies would fight on an open field in broad daylight, with fixed rules and codes of conduct. The Peloponnesian War changed everything. Desperate to win, both Athens and Sparta conducted sneak attacks, started revolutions, committed atrocities, and, on the rare occasion, mass murder. This war also ended Athens' Golden Age and paved the way for Philip of Macedon to conquer the Hellenic world. Thucydides, who chronicled the war, correctly said his work was a possession for all time. The start of the Peloponnesian War can be traced back to 499 BC, where a group of Ionian Greek city-states lived in the western province of the Persian Empire. Unhappy, they deposed their own tyrants and tried to end Persian domination. The Ionian Revolt was put down, but Athens' involvement forced the Persians to invade Greece. In 490, they sent a huge army to the plains of Marathon, just outside Athens. Surprisingly, the smaller Greek army crushed the Persians, forcing them to retreat back home. 10 years later, the Persian army, under the rule of Xerxes, invaded Greece again. This time, much of Greece fought together, with Sparta in charge of the army and Athens the navy. King Leonidas and the famed 300 Spartans lost at Thermopylae, but the Persian navy was defeated at the Battle of Salamis. The following year, in 479, the Persian army was destroyed at the Battle of Plataea, and its navy annihilated at Mycale. Greece was saved, and the Golden Age of Athens was about to begin. But over time, these victories grew so legendary, the heroes who fought a marathon at Thermopylae became Greece's greatest generation. The pressure was on for the leaders of the Peloponnesian War. They looked back at their grandparents' achievements and felt they had much to live up to. The next 50 years, from 479 to 431, was known as the Pentecotaetia. During this time, the Athenians gained dominance in the Aegean Sea, grew economically and culturally flourished. They also created a naval alliance known as the Delian League. What started as a defense alliance, though, eventually became an Athenian empire. Secession from the Delian League was not an option. Revolts were put down and cities were forced to pay tribute. Athens' behavior was troubling the rest of Greece. Just as Sparta was about to confront them, a massive earthquake in their land sparked a Helot revolt. The Athenians offered to help, but the Spartans, fearing they might help the revolt, sent them away. Deeply offended, Athens broke their treaty, fortified their city's defenses, and made an alliance with Argos, a major Spartan rival. More conflicts arose between Athens and Sparta, and by 460 the First Peloponnesian War began. The conflict ended in 445 with the signing of the 30 Years' Peace Treaty, but mistrust and resentment ran deep on both sides. The 30 Years' Peace was tested in 440, when Athens ordered the people on the island of Samos to break off an attack on Miletus. When they refused, the Athenians blockaded Samos, forcing the island to surrender. The Spartans wanted to send troops, but were stopped by their allies who were not prepared to go to war. Over the next few years, Athens became increasingly aggressive. In 433, Athens aligned itself with Corcyra during the Battle of Cyzicus, turning Corinth into enemies. Then it attacked the city of Plataea, the gateway to Thrace and its raw materials, forcing Corinth to defend the city and beg Sparta to declare war. The last straw was in 432. After a series of insults, Athens imposed sanctions against the city of Megara, another Spartan ally. The Megarian decree the first recorded use of trade sanctions as a foreign policy tool, blocked Megara from trading in any port in the Aegean. Unable to trade, the city was isolated and its economy ruined. These disputes, along with a general perception that Athens had grown too powerful, led to the meeting of the Spartan Assembly. The debate to go to war with Athens was hotly contested, with representatives from Megara, Corinth, and even Athens arguing their side. Most of the assembly pushed for war, especially the Corinthians, who argued that inaction against a dynamic city like Athens would be the end of Sparta. Their way of life was so enticing, the Corinthians added, that the entire Greek world would eventually embrace democracy, leaving Sparta alone and isolated. Now was the time to attack. At the 11th hour, a Spartan delegation traveled to Athens with an offer. Withdraw the Megarian decree and there will be no war. The Athenians immediately rejected it. Frustrated, the Spartans sent a final ultimatum.
The Spartans want peace, and there will be peace if you give the Greeks their autonomy.
When the final ultimatum was turned down, the Peloponnesian League declared war on Athens. The first phase of the Peloponnesian War was named after King Archidamus of Sparta, who, ironically, did not want to invade Athens. In fact, not only was he against the war, he proclaimed,
"The war would last long enough to bequeath to our children."
The Peloponnesian League, which Sparta commanded, was an alliance of states from the Peloponnese and central Greece. Two key allies were Corinth, a land and sea power, and Thebes, a major military power every bit the equal of Sparta's. Membership did not require paying tribute to Sparta, but rather providing troops to be under its command. The undisputed leader was Archidamus, one of the two kings of Sparta, who ruled from 467 to 427. Known for his wisdom and prudence, Archidamus was also a personal friend of Pericles. The Delian League, named after the island of Delos, where the treasury was stored, had nearly 300 members. The League was a common defense pact against the Persian Empire, and its members were cities in Asia Minor, the Thracian coast, and the Aegean Islands. Each state had an equal vote regardless of size. Some contributed ships, others money. Athens had an army of 13,000 hoplites, plus 16,000 more soldiers in garrisons and on home duty at Athens. The army also consisted of 1,200 horses, including mounted archers, with 1,600 unmounted archers. But the heart of Athens' military was the trireme, a devastating warship with 3 banks of oars. Fast, maneuverable, and with a bronze-clad ram on the prow to sink an enemy ship, the trireme was able to reach speeds of up to 9 knots in short bursts. Crammed inside were 170 rowers in 3 tiers along each side of the vessel. 62 in the top tier, 54 in the middle, and 54 in the bottom. Another 30 men served as marines, helmsman, and captain, for a total crew of 200. The rowers were famed for discipline, self-confidence, and cockiness. They moved with a care and flair that turned ordinary maneuvers into showpieces. Even Corinth, a key Spartan ally known for its navy, dared not face an Athenian trireme on the open sea. Athens was led by the famous statesman Pericles, an annually elected politician and general. Pericles led Athens for nearly 30 years. And when the treasury was moved from Delos to Athens in 454, he used the revenue to carry out massive building projects, including the famous temple known as the Parthenon. As for the size of Sparta's army, the numbers were kept a secret, but ancient sources estimate the Peloponnesian army that marched to Athens in 431 consisted of as many as 60,000 hoplites, 3 times the size of the Athenian phalanx. Facing such a formidable army head-on was suicide, and Pericles knew it. The undisputed leaders of the Peloponnesian League were the Spartans, the ancient world's greatest soldiers. To create an unstoppable army, every Spartan boy entered the agoge, the ruthless education program at the age of 7. The goal was to create soldiers loyal to the state, who never retreated and never surrendered. Their leader, of course, was King Archidamus of Sparta. Scholars estimate Athens had a population of approximately 60,000 adult male citizens, and, including the area of Attica, a total population of about 300,000. Of this number, approximately 100,000 were slaves and 50,000 were resident foreigners. Sparta's population, which included their conquered neighbors, was approximately 250,000. The vast majority belonged to two classes: non-citizen freemen known as periaki and state serfs known as helots. Only a few thousand men were full Spartan citizens. The main advantage of the Peloponnesian League was its superior land army, the best in the world, led by the fearless Spartans. In addition, as a self-reliant land-based power, the League was not vulnerable to naval blockades or threats to trade. The League's main weakness was that it had no money. Since the Spartans did not collect taxes or tribute, they could not fight the type of war needed to break Athens: naval and siege warfare. As for Athens, their great advantage was their thalassocracy. In other words, they ruled the sea. With a series of fortifications protecting their major harbors like Piraeus, Athens was free to import grain from anywhere in the Mediterranean. Also, their navy was the best in the world. Consisting of at least 300 ships, it allowed them to attack whenever and wherever they liked and retreat just as quickly. Their main weakness was that their land army was no match against the Spartans. This forced the Athenians to retreat behind their city walls whenever it was invaded. Also, if the Spartans could find a way to destroy the Athenian fleet, Athens would be brought to her knees. Unfortunately, the strengths of both sides and the inability to overcome each other's weaknesses meant a long and grueling war. Sparta was ruled by an oligarchy, a form of government where a small group of people had total power. These wealthy elites used power in the interests of their own class. In other words, government by the few and for the few. Athens was ruled by a direct democracy, a form of government where all males shared power. Democracies granted all male citizens equal rights and the chance to reach the highest levels of government, regardless of wealth or status. Oligarchies kept wealth within their elite group. Democracies redistributed wealth amongst all citizens. Oligarchies also believed power should lie with the rich, educated class, not the mass of poor, uneducated people who were easily swayed. Hence, they thought democracies were a dangerous form of government that should be stopped. As for the war, most of what we know comes from the great historian Thucydides and his seminal work, The History of the Peloponnesian War. An Athenian general, Thucydides was exiled in 423 for allowing the Spartans to take the city of Amphipolis. He spent the next 20 years collecting sources and writing, but his work is incomplete. The text ends abruptly in mid-sentence, 7 years before the end of the war. Fortunately, his work was continued by a younger contemporary named Xenophon in his book, Hellenica. Fighting began in March 431 at Plataea, 7 months before the formal declaration of war. It was launched not by Sparta, but by its powerful ally Thebes, a longtime rival of Athens. On a cloudy night, over 300 Thebans snuck into Plataea and tried to seize power, but were ambushed by its citizens and killed. A sneak attack at night in peacetime was a complete violation of the code of honor. A dangerous precedent had been set. With the Theban attack on Plataea shattering the peace treaty, the Spartans ordered their allies to march into Attica. The grand army was led by King Archidamus, who, although reluctant, was honor-bound to do his best. Assuming a massive army at their doorstep would make them submit, the king sent an ambassador to Athens, but Pericles refused to meet with anyone while their army was on the march. The Spartan ambassador, who was dismissed, turned to his associates and said,
"This day will be the beginning of great misfortunes for the Greeks."
Archidamus had no choice but to proceed. He moved to Arcarne, a land near and dear to Athens. The army cut down grain crops and damaged vines and olive trees, but the entire countryside had been evacuated to the city. From the start, Pericles knew Sparta would try to draw them into a land battle by ravaging their countryside. Therefore, he instructed the citizens around Attica to retreat safely behind their walls and rely on their navy to win the war. This strategy seemed like it could work because the Athenians had encircled the city with a massive stone wall. He had also built the long walls, the broad 7-kilometer corridor which led all the way to the main port of Piraeus. With siege technology in its infancy, the Spartans could not breach the walls. Therefore, no matter what damage was done to the agricultural production of Attica, the Athenians could simply sail across the Aegean and import food. And they could pay for it using income from the Delian League and their silver mines. Also, with naval superiority and protected harbors, Athens could launch surprise attacks against the enemy before they had a chance to mount a coordinated defense. This two-pronged strategy devised by Pericles was simple. Avoid set battles with the Spartan infantry and attack Spartan territory from the sea. Pericles believed that with its superior resources, Athens would win a war of attrition. But when the enemy destroyed the land around Acharni, just a few miles away from the Acropolis, the mood in Athens quickly changed to fury, directed as much towards Pericles as to the Spartans. Some even hinted it was cowardly to hide behind walls and not face the enemy. But Pericles stood firm and ignored their personal attacks. Pericles' only response was sending cavalry to stop the Peloponnesians from coming too close to the city. But by this point, the invading army had been in Attica for nearly a month and were running out of supplies. Knowing the Athenians would never come out and fight, Archidamus moved his army eastward to ravage the area between Mount Parnes and Pentelicus, then returned home. The Athenians were essentially unharmed. Devastating crops and burning groves sound in theory, but not effective, at least in southern Greece. Attica possessed more olive trees and grapevines than people, and uprooting them was difficult. Burning olive trees was even more difficult. And any lost grain could easily be imported. Athens had survived the first attack and was plotting its revenge. Athens assembled a fleet of 100 ships, plus 50 from Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, then set out to destroy enemy territory. The Athenians landed on the Peloponnesian coast and ravaged the town of Methone. The poorly defended town was saved by the bravery of Brasidas, a skillful and intelligent Spartan officer, who reinforced the local garrison during the attack. Next, the fleet sailed to Aegina, an island close to the port of Piraeus. Worried the island could be used to block trade and attack their harbor, the Athenians expelled the entire population of Aegina and replaced it with their own colonists. In other words, they ethnically cleansed the island. The Athenians also solidified their position in the northern Aegean by securing alliances with Abdera, Sitalces of Thrace, and more importantly, Perdiccas, king of Macedon. On a roll in late 431, Pericles himself led a large Athenian army into the town of Megara, who were still under the trade embargo. Leading an army on the field not only restored Pericles' prestige, but it lifted the spirits of an entire city. Since the beginning of the war, Athenians had been on the defense. Flexing a little muscle restored some of their mojo. The Megara campaign restored Pericles' reputation in Athens. And when the funeral rites for the war's fallen soldiers were to be held, Pericles was chosen by the city as the wisest and most esteemed to deliver their eulogy. Like Abraham Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg, Pericles' funeral oration, or Epitaphios Logos, was designed to explain why the citizens of Athens must endure the war. He praised Athenian democracy, the beauty of the city, and its superiority to Sparta's way of life. And for the men who died fighting, he offered them immortality.
Those who gave their lives for the common good won for themselves praise that never grows old and the most distinguished of all graves. Their glory remains in all eternal memory, always there at the right time to inspire speech and action.
In May of 430, the second year of war, King Archidamus again led the Peloponnesian army to Athens. They destroyed most of the land around Attica, but like before, the citizens found refuge behind their walls. The army stayed for 40 days, the longest of the war, then left when their supplies ran low. With Athens secure, Pericles led 100 triremes, along with 50 from Chios and Lesbos, against the city of Epidavros. He thought controlling a city in the Peloponnese would not only threaten Corinth, but encourage Argos, Sparta's ancient rival, to join their side. Unfortunately, the mission was a failure, and with the Peloponnesian army heading home, the fleet sailed back to Athens. An even greater reason for Pericles to sail home was the news that a plague had broken out in Athens. The epidemic began in Ethiopia. It swept Egypt, Libya, and even the Persian Empire before appearing in Athens. Those infected suffered from fever, insomnia, and the need to be totally naked without any linen resting on their body. Others even wanted to submerge themselves in water. The next stage, 7 or 8 days later, saw the pestilence descend to the bowels, genitals, fingers, and toes. Some people even went blind. Greek religion demanded a proper burial for the dead, but centuries of tradition were ignored. Corpses were thrown into piles for cremation or left to rot in the streets. As the death toll climbed, the city descended into lawlessness. Carnal pleasures and living for the moment were all that mattered. With the Peloponnesians ravaging Attica, close to 300,000 people were crammed inside Athens. Some slept in tents, others on the streets, with little access to clean water or proper sanitation, all prime conditions for disease to spread. The great city had essentially turned into a refugee camp. With their world crumbling, the people turned on Pericles and sent ambassadors to Sparta to sue for peace. No one knows for sure why, but Sparta rejected their offer. Perhaps they thought with Athens on its knees, the best course of action would be to continue until unconditional surrender. Disgusted with Sparta's behavior, Pericles went on the attack. He urged Athenians not to fear losing the war, but to fear making a bad peace. And for the first time, he referred to the Delian League as an empire and a tyranny. He also admitted it may have been wrong to have taken it, but it is surely dangerous to let it go. Still, Pericles' enemies continued to attack, eventually charging him with embezzlement. He was found guilty, ordered to pay a heavy fine, and forced out of office. He would be reinstated a few months later, but the plague would bring an end to his brilliant career. Late in the summer, Sparta attacked the island of Zakynthos, an ally of Athens. When they failed to take the island, the Spartans realized they needed to build a navy, so they sent an embassy to the one man who could finance it, Artaxerxes, king of Persia. On the way there, the delegation stopped at the court of Sitalces in Thrace and asked him to break the alliance with Athens and join them. A pair of Athenian ambassadors, who happened to be present, persuaded the Thracian court to arrest the Peloponnesians and send them to Athens. As soon as they arrived, the Peloponnesians were put to death without a trial, and their bodies were thrown into a pit. Athenians argued self-defense, because Sparta threatened to kill enemies on sight. Thucydides would go on to say,
"War is a violent teacher."
In 429, one of the main causes of the war finally ended. Athens' siege of Plataea. Lasting well over 2 years, the siege exhausted the city's food supply and reduced its people to cannibalism. The cost was staggering, over 2,000 talents, leaving Athens' treasury depleted. When the last few survivors left, the city was ethnically cleansed and resettled with Athenian colonists. Later that summer, Sparta decided to attack the small town of Plataea. This was a low for Sparta. Plataea was of little strategic importance, but Thebes wanted vengeance for the loss of their 300 soldiers who failed to take the city 2 years earlier. The Greek world sadly looked on as the symbolic town was about to be invaded. Back in 490, Plataea was the only city to send an army to help the Athenians fight the Persians at Marathon. And after the Battle of Plataea in 479, which ended the Persian Wars, the Spartans took an oath to keep Plataea independent, and that
no one should march against them unjustly or for their enslavement.
The Plataeans were given an option: join the fight against Athens or remain neutral. After consulting Athens, Plataea rejected the Spartan proposal and prepared the city's defenses. The siege would last for over a year and not end well for them. During the winter of 429, an Athenian admiral named Phormio was sent to the Corinthian Gulf with a fleet of triremes. After establishing his base at Naupactus, Phormio set up a blockade of Corinthian shipping. By the summer, a large Peloponnesian fleet and army was sent to capture Naupactus. The first battle took place when the Peloponnesian fleet sailed into the Gulf of Corinth. The Athenians had 20 ships, the Peloponnesians had 47 ships, loaded with heavy infantry. The Peloponnesians formed in a defensive circle, prows facing outwards. The Athenians took up a standard formation, ready to attack. For over a century, the Athenian navy had been regarded as the best in the world. Their disciplined, well-trained soldiers had perfected devastating tactics, such as the Periplus, where the enemy is outflanked and hit at the rear or side, and the Dikplus, where a ship sails through a gap in the enemy line, turns around, then rams the ship. Now the Athenians were ready to show the Spartans why they had earned their reputation. Sensing an advantage, Phormio came up with a risky plan. He ordered his ships to circle around the enemy fleet, making their circle grow tighter and more susceptible to rough waters. Suddenly, a wind blew up, causing the inexperienced Peloponnesian crews to foul their oars. During this moment of confusion, the Athenians attacked. The Peloponnesians were completely overwhelmed, losing 12 ships, including their crews. Their first major naval battle ended in a humiliating defeat and left the Spartans shocked. In the second battle, Phormio triumphed against an even larger Peloponnesian fleet of 77 ships. This victory ensured Athenian naval supremacy and discouraged future enemy naval operations. In September of 429, Pericles, the first citizen of Athens, passed away. His final days were not happy. He had been removed from office, most of his family and friends were dead, and his strategy to win the war was ineffective. And his policy of allowing thousands of refugees inside the city intensified the effects of the plague, a plague that, according to Thucydides, caused the most harm to Athenian power. Still, Pericles was a brilliant leader and a gifted politician, and all great leaders have a vision, and his was to transform Athens into the Queen City of Greece. The Parthenon, the famous temple that has inspired countless buildings, owed its existence to his vision and energy. With the death of Pericles, two men emerged as leaders of Athens. Nicias, a moderate politician who favored peace with Sparta, and Cleon, an aggressive war hawk who wanted to expand the empire. Although the personalities of both men were different, both wanted Athens to win the war. In 428, the Peloponnesians were back at it again with the third invasion of Attica. Like they had done twice before, they burned crops and caused damage for a month, then headed home. On the island of Lesbos, though, a situation would arise that could affect the Athenian Empire. Lesbos held a unique status in the Delian League. Its chief city, Mytilenean, was an oligarchy, a system of government democratic Athens hated. And the island never paid taxes. Their only contribution to the league was providing ships. Even with this favored status, the citizens of Mytilenean wanted to leave the Delian League. With Athens weakened by the plague, they built defensive walls, increased the size of their navy, and forged alliances with the Black Sea region for grain supplies. But before they could complete the preparations, word got back to Athens. In June, Athens sent a fleet to Lesbos, ordering the walls to be taken down and their ships surrendered. While stalling for time, a spokesman was sent to Sparta asking for help. They planned to send help, but when Athens raided the Peloponnese with 100 triremes, the Spartans backed down. Mytilene and the island of Lesbos were now left to face Athens alone. Athens surrounded the island and applied a blockade. And with little support from the Spartans, Mytilene eventually collapsed. The furious Athenians took the ringleaders captive, plus a few thousand who joined the rebellion. During a wild debate, Cleon the Warhawk pushed to slaughter the entire male population of the island and sell the women and children into slavery. In the end, only 1,000 were executed, but Mytilene's walls were torn down and its ships confiscated. Most of the island was then ethnically cleansed and redistributed to Athenian settlers. In 427, the defenders of Plataea finally surrendered. It took the Peloponnesians 2 years to besiege a small town that had essentially been abandoned. Knowing it was the Thebans who were the real aggressors and not the Spartans who were trying to please them, the Plataeans appealed to their sense of decency.
Sparta would redeem themselves and earn glory throughout Greece. if they were allowed to live.
The Spartans rejected their plea for mercy and assembled a group of judges to decide their fate. Bringing the Plataean defenders before them one by one, the judges asked if he had done Sparta or its allies any service in the war. Whoever said no was killed on the spot. After all the men were slaughtered, the city was given to the Thebans, who burned it to the ground. Athens made no attempt to intercede. As Plataea was about to fall, trouble was brewing with Athens' most powerful naval ally, the island of Corcyra. It all started when a group of prisoners, captured at the Battle of Sparta in 433, returned home to Corcyra. The 250 prisoners were treated well by their Corinthian captives. So well, they flipped sides and began to subvert their own democratically elected government. Eventually, civil war broke out between the Democrats and the oligarchs who wanted to join the Peloponnesian League. Helped by the Athenian navy, the Democrats won. The losers were shown no mercy. Anyone charged with subverting democracy was put to death. What Thucydides described next was a terror state.
Some perished merely as a result of private hatred. Others were murdered by those who owed them money. In fact, father murdered son. Suppliants were dragged from the temples and executed on the spot. Some others were even walled inside the temple of Dionysus and thus perished.
For 7 days, the Athenian assembly did nothing to stop the slaughter of almost every oligarch on the island. A new precedent had been set. Revolution in the Athenian alliance would not be tolerated, even if it meant mass murder. 427 continued to be a busy year. In the summer, the Peloponnesians invaded Attica for a 4th time with the same old results. But Athens, with a new aggressive mindset after Corcyra's civil war, decided to get involved in another internal conflict. They sent 20 ships to Sicily to help the people of Leontini, a town in the eastern part of the island who were under attack. The powerful city of Syracuse wanted to dominate its neighbors. War quickly spread throughout the island, even to mainland Italy. Athens sent assistance because a Sicily controlled by Syracuse, whose ancestors were originally from Corinth and allies of Sparta, posed a serious threat. Sailing off just in time to avoid a second outbreak of the plague, Athenian ships arrived at a base in Rhegium and joined the local resistance who were fighting against the Syracusans and their allies. Fighting would go on for 2 more years, and when it was obvious the situation was a stalemate, both sides agreed to negotiate. At the Congress of Gela in 424, the Sicilian cities made peace on the basis of
Sicily for the Sicilians.
Forced to accept the treaty, the Athenians quietly sailed away. About a decade later, though, they would return in an epic fashion. In 426, King Archidamus of Sparta died. His young son, King Agis, ascended to the throne, but as a regency. Meanwhile, Demosthenes, an Athenian who was in his first term as general, set out with a large fleet to patrol the Gulf of Corinth. During the patrol, he decided to attack the Corinthian colony of Lucas, but was defeated. Then he tried to invade the region of Aetolia, but was defeated again. Later that year, though, Demosthenes redeemed himself by stopping a Spartan attack against Naupactus. He also won 2 decisive victories over the Spartans. One at Olpae, where Spartan or allies lost 1,000 men, and another at Idomeni. Now a respected naval commander, in 425, the Athenian assembly authorized Demosthenes to use his fleet for operations around the Peloponnese, even while the Spartans invaded Attica for a 5th time. Demosthenes decided to fortify the promontory of Pylos, but a military fortification close to home was a direct threat and the Spartans attacked. First, the Spartans attacked the camp on land, but anticipating this move, Demosthenes moved his men to the beach and stopped them. Next, the Spartans attacked at sea, but the main Athenian fleet arrived. defeated the Spartan fleet and captured a number of its ships. This left a small Spartan army cut off on the island of Sphacteria. When it was obvious the captives could not be rescued, Sparta began to negotiate. We must stop and ask the following question. Why was Sparta so invested in recovering a few hundred prisoners? The answer is that with a small population, they could not afford to lose them. Within this group of hostages were 180 full Spartan citizens, knights that made up almost 10% of their elite fighting force. Losing even a small number of blue-blooded warriors was a catastrophe. Sparta presented its peace offer directly to the Athenian assembly. In exchange for the captives on Sphacteria, Sparta proposed an alliance between the two cities. This proposal would even allow Athens to keep some of its newfound territories. This was a wonderful chance to end the war, but Athens, out of fear that Sparta would eventually renew their attacks, turned down the offer. Cleon argued that if Sparta truly wanted peace, they would agree to the state of affairs that existed before the 30 years peace of 445. After peace negotiations failed, the Athenians attacked the captives and forced the Spartans to surrender, an unheard of event. Spartan hoplites, the mythical heroes of Thermopylae, the greatest warriors in the ancient world, did not lose infantry battles. And on the rare occasion they did, at least they never surrendered. No single event affected the war like the capture of the Spartan knights of Sphacteria. Out of fear the prisoners would be executed, the Spartans stopped their invasion of Attica. Cleon the Warhawk, who masterminded their captive, became a hero, and the myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered. Thucydides wrote,
Of everything that happened in the war, this came as the greatest surprise to the Greeks.
The following year in 424, the Athenians moved against Cythera, an island off the coast of the southern Peloponnese. Modeled on the success at Pylos, the invasion was part of a greater strategy: build military installations close to Sparta. After some initial resistance, the Athenians took the island and established a garrison. Next, they sailed to Thyrea, a town populated with Aegiatans. These were the inhabitants of the island of Aegina, whom the Athenians had expelled from their homes at the beginning of the war. Unopposed, the Athenians burned the city, scattered the indigenous population throughout the Aegean islands, then killed all the Aegiatans. According to Thucydides, the reason for killing the Aegiatans was because they had been enemies in the past. Another war atrocity had been committed. Later that summer, Athens decided to invade the city of Megara. No people had suffered more since the start of the war. The Megarian decree, the world's first trade embargo, had destroyed their economy. Aided by a local democratic faction, generals Demosthenes and Hippocrates captured the port town of Nicaea, which had long walls connecting it to Megara. Just as they were about to invade Megara, Spartan commander Brasidas appeared with a Peloponnesian army. Scared to face them head-on, the Athenians retreated back to Nicaea, allowing the oligarchic faction to welcome the Spartans into Megara. With the city secure, the oligarchic faction executed the pro-Athenian Democrats, then became a loyal ally of the Peloponnesian League. Undeterred by the failure at Megara, the Athenians hatched another plan inciting a democratic revolt. In August, generals Demosthenes and Hippocrates decided to help the democratic leaders of Boeotia seize power. The plan was intricate. Simultaneously take control of Siphae, Charonia, and the sanctuary of Apollo at Delium. But months passed before the plan could be implemented, and by then word had spread to Boeotia, who sent armies to occupy Siphae and Charonia. Delium could not be saved though, and it fell under Athenian control. But the Athenians had committed a major taboo, violation of the sanctuary of Apollo. By sending troops to occupy sacred ground, the time-honored rules of engagement were rejected yet again. Still, the Athenians pressed ahead and built a military fort at Delium in 3 days. Meanwhile, the main Boeotian army had assembled a few miles away at the city of Tanagra, but it debated how to proceed. Pagondas, an older wealthy aristocrat and commander of the Boeotian army, persuaded his men to stand their ground and fight the Athenians. Hippocrates' army had 7,000 hoplites and over 10,000 local and foreign allies. The Boeotian army had 7,000 hoplites, 10,000 light armed troops, 1,000 cavalry, and 500 peltasts. Pagondas' battle plan was intriguing. To counteract any flanking maneuvers, he placed Boeotian cavalry and light armed troops on both sides of the phalanx. And on the right side, he tripled the Theban contingent from a depth of 8 to 25 men, an unheard of number. As Hippocrates gave his speech to his men, the Boeotians attacked, catching the Athenian army off guard. Still, the Athenians regrouped and fought back, crushing the center and the left flank of the Boeotian army. But the intensity of the fight was so great that during the encirclement, many Athenian soldiers killed each other. Historians consider this the first recorded case of friendly fire. In this fog of war, Athenian commanders failed to realize their left had been crushed by the deep hoplite formation of Boeotians' right. Meanwhile, Pagondas ordered 2 reserve squadrons of cavalry to save Boeotia's center and left, a crucial decision that changed the entire outcome of the battle. According to Thucydides, the unexpected shock of the cavalry charge broke the will of the entire Athenian line and scattered its men. This advanced battle strategy, devised by Pagondas, a first in Greek warfare, left the Boeotian army in control of the battlefield. Boeotia lost approximately 500 soldiers. The Athenians lost 1,000, including their commander Hippocrates. With the main Athenian army in full retreat, the Boeotians turned their attention to the Athenian troops hiding inside the temple of Apollo. Unable to storm the temple's fortifications, they constructed a crude but enormous flamethrower to set fire to the walls and drive out the defenders. Another first in warfare. As for the war, the Battle of Delium was the first major setback for the Athenians and their allies. The defeat proved Athens was no match on land for the Spartans or the Boeotian League, confirming Pericles' strategy of naval raids and defense. In the ancient world, the Battle of Delium was famous because Socrates fought in it as a hoplite and Alcibiades with the cavalry. And in modern times, the battle continues to be studied because it contains the first recorded use of advanced military tactics, flanking maneuvers using cavalry units, deep wing formations in a phalanx, and developing technology to solve a military problem. In the following years, these tactics would be used with devastating effects by Epaminondas of Thebes, Philip of Macedon, and his son Alexander. Simply put, the Battle of Delium changed the history of warfare. In August, around the time Athens was hatching the plan that led to the Battle of Delium, the gifted Spartan officer Brasidas had taken an army north towards Thrace. His plan was twofold: lead an army filled with hundreds of dangerous helots far away from Sparta, and attack Amphipolis, an important city that opened the gateway to the timber, gold, and silver of Thrace. By December, Brasidas arrived at Amphipolis, which contained a small Athenian garrison. Outmanned, the garrison senior officer sent a message to Thucydides, commander of the Athenian fleet in the region, and of course, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War. His message was quick and to the point: send reinforcements. Thucydides sailed to Amphipolis, but when he arrived it was too late. The Spartans had already taken the city. And to make matters worse, Brasidas convinced the citizens to peacefully surrender the city. The loss of Amphipolis angered the Athenians and they held Thucydides responsible. Put on trial and found guilty, he was sent into exile for the rest of the war, approximately 20 years. Apparently it was Cleon who charged Thucydides with treason, the standard charge against unsuccessful generals. The penalty for losing such a strategic city was harsh, but Cleon had a point. Brasidas was somehow able to assemble a small, ragtag army filled with slaves, march deep into enemy territory, and sweet-talk his way into a fortified city. Even if Thucydides was innocent, losing an important city without a fight was unforgivable. He had to go. Losing Amphipolis not only hurt Athens' prestige, but it encouraged rebellions throughout the rest of Thrace. Athens quickly reinforced the Thracian territories, but with the recent losses of Megara and Delium, the Athenian assembly was finally open to peace talks. Sparta, of course, had been offering terms ever since the capture of their knights on Sphacteria. It seemed that for the first time since the start of the war, peace was a possibility. In the spring of 423, Athens and Sparta agreed to a one-year truce. Under its terms, the Spartans promised not to put warships to sea, while the Athenians pledged not to receive Helots escaping to Pylos. Athens was also allowed to keep some of its newfound territories across Greece. The generous terms proved the Spartans were sincere and eager for peace. Unfortunately, the Boeotians, Corinthians, and the rest of the Peloponnesian allies rejected the truce. The greatest obstacle to de-escalation was the brilliant Spartan commander Brasidas, who, during the peace negotiations, won over most of Thrace to his side. The town of Scione in Thrace was so impressed with Brasidas, they gave him a golden crown and proclaimed him liberator of Hellas, an unprecedented gesture for any Greek. Angry with Scione for switching sides and joining the Spartans, the Athenian assembly ordered the city be destroyed and its citizens put to death. The loss of territories in the north put an end to Pericles' moderate imperial policy. From now on, Athenians would rule by terror. To their credit though, both Athens and Sparta honored the one-year truce and even extended it into the summer of 422. By August though, Athens had lost its patience. Instead of punishing Brasidas, whose renegade actions had threatened the truce, Sparta sent him reinforcements. The Athenians reacted by sending an expeditionary force to recover Amphipolis and the other lost cities, led by Cleon himself. The expedition started off well. With Brasidas away, Torone was taken easily. Its adult males were sent to Athens as hostages, and the women and children were sold into slavery. The Athenians also established a base at Eion and re-established relations with Perdiccas, king of Macedon. Brasidas returned to Amphipolis, and within a short time the two armies met. The Spartans hammered the Athenians. Only 7 Spartans died, while 600 Athenians fell. Both Cleon and Brasidas died on the battlefield. Thucydides characterized both leaders as the men on each side most opposed to peace. After the battle, neither the Spartans nor the Athenians wanted to continue the war. Sparta wanted their 120 knights returned, and Athens needed time to heal from the defeats at Megara, Boeotia, and Delium. And with war hawks like Cleon and Brasidas gone, moderate voices, led by the respected general Nicias, assumed control. Even playwrights like Aristophanes, who staged Peace days before their agreement was approved, expressed joy at the prospects of the war's end.
Comrades, think of all the 1,000 pleasures which to peace we owe, all the life of ease and comfort which she gave us long ago.
Still, negotiations moved slowly. Only when Sparta threatened to build a permanent base in Attica did Athens finally cave in. The Peace of Nicias was signed in 421 BC. Sworn for 50 years, it allowed free access to common shrines, established the independence of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and allowed independent third parties to peacefully settle disputes. Some of the provisions, though, were bound to cause problems. By relinquishing the northern Aegean to Athens, this meant a death sentence for the men of Scione. And with Athens agreeing to return all prisoners of war, including the 120 Spartan knights, the main deterrence against future aggressions was all but gone. And many of Sparta's allies refused to cooperate. Corinth, Boeotia, Elis, and Megara were completely opposed to the treaty, along with the conservatives of Sparta who tried to undermine it. Regardless of the future obstacles, the peace agreement was met with great joy throughout all of Greece. Plutarch, the ancient biographer, tells us that Nicias, more than anyone else, deserved to have the agreement named after him.
Nicias, a man beloved of God. Heaven had bestowed on him the privilege of giving his name to the greatest and fairest of blessings.
And with that, the decade-long Archidanian War came to an end, and the Peace of Nicias was ushered in. Even though the entire Greek world was thrilled with the Peace of Nicias, it was doomed from the start. Megara refused to honor the peace until they got back Nicaea, Elis because of a private quarrel with Sparta, and Corinth because Plataea and other colonies were still controlled by Athens. Worst of all, Sparta refused to return the city of Amphipolis back to Athens. Feeling betrayed by Sparta, Athens refused to evacuate its military base at Pylos. They also turned to the city of Argos, Sparta's longtime rival, and proposed a military coalition. Worried Argos would enter the war on the wrong side, Sparta quickly jumped in and offered Athens a 50-year alliance. The terms were simple. Both sides would defend each other against attack, and Athens would also commit troops to Sparta in case of a Helot revolt. To cement the deal, Athens returned the Spartan prisoners they still held. Even though it was unsustainable, Athens agreed to the alliance with Sparta, which dealt a serious blow to the Peloponnesian League. Argos was so scared these old rivals would oppress everyone, in 421 they created an alliance of their own, the League of Argos. The first to join was Mantinea, a democratic state that was expanding dangerously close to Sparta's border. Next was the city of Elis, followed by Corinth and Olynthus of northern Greece. Boeotia was offered the chance to join the League, but afraid to anger Sparta, they passed. While alliances were shifting, Athens finally completed its siege of Scione. The city of Scione was once an ally of Athens, but back in 423 it decided to switch sides and join the Peloponnesian League. When Athens took the city, they killed all the men, enslaved the women and children, and gave the land to the refugees of Plataea, the city that had been massacred by the Peloponnesians in 427. The destruction of Scione added another event to the list of war massacres. And back in Athens, the pro-war, anti-Spartan faction was growing, led by the gifted young general Alcibiades. Strikingly handsome, intelligent, and a student of Socrates, Alcibiades argued that Sparta could never be trusted, and their long-term goal was the complete destruction of Athens. In 420, after Sparta ignored a direct ultimatum, asking them to disarm and return lost territories, Athens signed a non-aggression pact with the League of Argos. Alcibiades' next move was to force Epidaurus into their new alliance, but not wanting to break the treaty with Sparta, he convinced Argos to attack them. Anticipating this move, King Agis of Sparta marched an army to Epidaurus. They came across the Argive army, but did not engage them. The following year, in the summer of 418, Argos attacked Epidaurus again. King Agis did not stand down this time. Instead, he invaded Argos, and the two armies met in a nearby town. But just as the battle was about to begin, a pair of Argive generals asked to meet with the Spartan king. Surprisingly, they convinced him to agree to a 4-month truce. But both sides were unhappy with their leader. Argos was confident their army would have won, and the Spartans were upset with their king because he had a chance to destroy Argos. A short while later, the Spartans grew even more incensed when they realized his failure to destroy Argos resulted in the loss of the strategically important city of Orchomenus. King Agis' reputation was nearly destroyed, but a chance of redemption arrived when he heard that a democratic faction was about to bring the city of Tegea over to the League of Argos. In August, the king quickly assembled an army and marched north to save it. When the Argive army refused to fight, the Spartans moved towards the town of Mantinea and began to ravage the local countryside. The Battle of Mantinea is one of the most important battles ever fought between Greek states. It was also the largest hoplite battle of the Peloponnesian War. The Spartan army numbered approximately 9,000 hoplites. This included 3,600 Spartans, the 2,000 veterans commanded by Brasidas in Thrace, 600 Skiditae, and another 3,000 Arcadians and Aeaeans. The League of Argos numbered approximately 8,000 hoplites. This included 5,000 Argives, 2,000 Mantineans, Cleonians, Orneans, 1,000 Athenian hoplites, and 300 Athenian horsemen. After the Spartans had destroyed the countryside, the Argives approached them but took a position uphill. Trying to redeem himself, Agis ordered his army to follow them uphill, a difficult task. But just as the army was within javelin range, he suddenly ordered it to stop and turn back. Thucydides tells us that a Spartan veteran warned the king to not try to erase past mistakes with a reckless attack, or as he said, cure one evil with another. Instead, the Spartans redirected the flow of a river into Mantinean territory, hoping it would force the Argives to abandon their strong position. And it did when the Argive army came down off the hill and formed up on the plains. The League of Argos placed the Mantineans, who were fighting for their homeland, on the right wing. Beside them were their Arcadian allies, along with the 1,000 well-trained troops from Argos. At the center were ordinary hoplites from Argos, along with the Cleonians and Orneans. On the left wing were 1,000 Athenian hoplites, supported with their own cavalry. King Agis placed the Skiditae and Arcadians on the left wing. Beside them were Brasidas' men and a group of freed Helots. The main Spartan army was at the center. Beside them were their Arcadian allies. The Aeaeans were placed on the right, supported by a small force of Spartans who held the extreme right. The cavalry was split, protecting both wings. As the armies advanced towards each other, both of the right wings became overextended. Seeing his left wing was about to be encircled, Agis ordered Brasidas' men and the Skiditae to move further left to match the positions of the Mantineans. Because this created a dangerous gap in the line, he also ordered 2 Spartan regiments to move from the right to fill the gap. This was a first in Greek warfare. Never before had a general changed a line in the heat of battle, and to fill one gap by opening another gap was unheard of. At this point, the Mantineans and the elite hoplites from Argos had crushed the Spartan left. But instead of joining the rest of their army, they decided to chase the defeated soldiers back to camp. Without additional support, the Spartans destroyed the Argive center, forcing the Cleonians, Orneans, and Athenians to retreat. The Aeaeans and Spartans had also won the right, and now threatened to surround the rest of the Argive army. Only the bravery of the Athenian cavalry saved them, along with the crumbling Spartan left, which forced Agis to stop the assault and reinforced it. This allowed the entire Argive army to escape, and forced the victorious Mantineans and elite hoplites from Argos to retreat as well. The League of Argos suffered heavy casualties, over 1,000 men. The Spartans only lost 300. The Spartans sent an embassy to Argos with a peace offer. The Argives accepted the treaty, which forced them to renounce their alliance with Elis, Mantinea, and Athens, essentially ending the League of Argos. Even though democratic factions would eventually seize power in Argos, the city remained neutral for the rest of the Peloponnesian War. By winning one single battle, the Spartans regained authority over the Peloponnese and restored their reputation as the world's greatest soldiers. 24 years would go by before anyone dared face them again in open battle. Over in Athens, both Nicias and Alcibiades were re-elected as generals. With both men holding opposing ideologies, and equally popular, the city was in a political stalemate. Peace, though, had allowed the Athenians to refill their war chest, and a new generation of young men had come of age who were eager and willing to fight. But an aggressive idea had entered their minds. The sea and everyone that used it was theirs. It is no surprise then that in 416, Athens decided to invade the small island of Melos. Founded by Dorians sympathetic to Sparta, Melos had refused to join the Delian League, but remained neutral throughout the war. Neutral or not, they had helped Sparta in the past and were considered an enemy state, resulting in an unsuccessful Athenian attack on the island 10 years earlier. Ready to prove their naval superiority, Athens and its allies sent 38 ships and over 3,000 hoplites to the island. After the recent troubles at Scione and other parts of Thrace, the Athenians were in no mood to negotiate. They wanted to rule by terror. Athens demanded that Melos join the Delian League or face destruction. And when the Melians refused, the Athenians attacked their island and forced them to surrender. All the men were killed, the women and children sold into slavery, and the land redistributed to Athenian colonists. Thucydides tells us the leaders of both sides met to discuss the issues at stake. The Melians relied on the concept of justice, the Athenians on realism. Known today as the Melian Dialogue, the Melians argued their cause was just, and the gods would not allow their defeat. The Athenians countered that they outnumbered them, had a larger fleet and army. Out for blood and knowing no one could stop them, the Athenians ruthlessly proclaimed,
"The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must."
Back in 427, the growing power of Syracuse forced Athens to send help to the city of Leontini. A decade later, in the winter of 416, Leontini was at war again with Syracuse. And when the Athenian-friendly city of Segasta attacked Selinus, an ally of Syracuse, Athens decided to send help again. The growth of Syracuse worried Athens. Unchecked, the powerful city could take control of Sicily and tip the balance of power in favor of the Peloponnesians. Originally, Athens wanted to send a small army to support their Sicilian allies. But Nicias, who was against the expedition from the start, accidentally convinced the Athenian assembly to send a much larger one. Thucydides wrote that the entire mission was done out of greed. Athens wanted to conquer Sicily, and perhaps even Carthage, and young men like Alcibiades were out for glory. For the time being, however, the official plan was to support the allies only, and the commanders were Lamachus, Nicias, and Alcibiades. In June 415, the expedition started with a force of 134 triremes, 5,100 hoplites, 1,300 light-armed troops, 700 slaves who served as marines, and 30 cavalry. Syracusan forces were approximately 5,000 hoplites, 1,200 cavalry, and over 100 triremes. But on the eve of departure, a terrible event rocked the city. Many of the Hermae, stone sculptures of the god Hermes, were mutilated and destroyed. Some thought this was a bad omen, others thought it was a conspiracy to overthrow the government. Still, the fleet sailed off to great fanfare, but when it arrived on Sicily, most of the allies knew the Athenians were up to no good and refused to help. Alcibiades' plan was to find new allies, create a base, and then attack Syracuse. After some debate, his plan was selected, and a base was created at Catani. Just when the invasion was about to begin, news arrived from Athens. Alcibiades was ordered home to stand trial for mutilating the Hermae. Worried he would be held responsible and put to death, Alcibiades fled to mainland Italy, then headed straight for Sparta. Even without Alcibiades, the expedition continued. First, it attacked the small barbarian town of Hyccara and sold its population into slavery. Then it beat the Syracusan army on the bank of the river Anapus in the First Battle of Sicily. A few months later, in the spring of 414, the siege of Syracuse began. Needing a stronghold to conduct operations, the Athenians built a fort called the Circle. Next, they began to build a series of walls around Syracuse. The plan was to block the city off from the rest of the island and force it to surrender. To stop this, the Syracusans began to build their own series of counterwalls. Meanwhile, reinforcements from Athens arrived: 250 cavalry, 30 mounted archers, and 300 talents of silver, which was used to pay for 400 cavalry from Sicilian allies. During the construction of these walls, the two armies crossed paths and a battle broke out. Athens won, but Lamachus died, leaving Nicias in command. Nicias pushed ahead and extended the wall to the sea, then sent the fleet into the harbor, completely surrounding Syracuse. All that was left was to set up bases for supplies and weapons at Lambulum. It seemed Syracuse was lost, but a Spartan task force would change everything. To Syracuse's joy and surprise, Gylippus, a Spartan military advisor, brought reinforcements from Sparta, Corinth, and Sicily. 1,700 hoplites, 100 cavalry, and 100 Sicel warriors. After landing at Himera, Gylippus marched to Syracuse and began to build a new counterwall to stop the Athenians from finishing their northern wall. Nicias tried to stop them, but was defeated by the Syracusan cavalry, allowing the counterwall to be completed. To make matters worse, Gylippus also captured the Athenian base of Lambulum. With the situation growing hopeless, a frustrated Nicias sent a letter to Athens asking to either be sent reinforcements or to be sent home. The Athenians chose to send more troops and continue the fight. Taking command of the Syracusan forces, Gylippus devised a plan to attack the Athenians at land and sea. During the night, he led his army towards Plataea, an important enemy base, while at the same time, 80 Syracusan triremes approached them from the sea. The Athenians won the battle in the harbor, but Gylippus beat them on land and captured Plataea, including most of their forts, which persuaded more cities to come to Syracuse's side. And things went from bad to worse when Athens lost 7 ships to Syracuse in a second naval battle. There was good news for the Athenians though. In 413, Eurymedon and Demosthenes finally arrived with 73 ships, 5,000 hoplites, 3,000 javelin throwers, slingers, bowmen, and supplies for all. Demosthenes landed his forces and attacked the Syracusan counterwall, which failed. Unfazed, in early August, he led a large army at night and successfully breached the wall, but was defeated by the Spartan army. At least 2,000 of his men died, as was any hope of a quick victory. A meeting was held in the Athenian camp. Demosthenes argued to leave while they still could. Nicias disagreed, but when Spartan reinforcements arrived, he knew it was time to go. On the night of August 27, the moon was totally eclipsed. Nicias, a superstitious man, was afraid to leave on such a night, so he consulted a soothsayer who advised to stay put for another 27 days. When the decision to stay got back to the Syracusans, they decided to attack the Athenians the next day. The battle took place in the main harbor. Syracuse sent 76 triremes to face 86 Athenian triremes. The battle was a disaster for Athens. Its entire fleet was routed and driven towards the shore, with most of its men abandoning their ships. The Spartans hunted down anyone fleeing on land, while the Syracusans hauled away the abandoned triremes. The Athenian commander Eurymedon was killed in the battle. The surviving Athenians regrouped and tried to escape, but the Syracusans blocked their exit by placing ships and hoplites around the mouth of the harbor. Thousands of local spectators watched as the final battle was about to begin. The Athenian plan was simple: sail straight for an opening in the enemy lines. A few triremes did break through, but when they stopped to help other ships escape, the Syracusan triremes attacked them from all sides. Nearly 200 ships were crammed in the harbor, and ramming the enemy, Athens' favorite naval tactic, was impossible. The fighting grew even more intense as soldiers boarded ships and fought hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, the Syracusans destroyed the Athenians. Like they had done before, desperate soldiers jumped ship and swam to shore. Only Demosthenes kept his cool. He wanted to gather all remaining ships and try one last escape. But the men were psychologically defeated. They refused to board their ships and then chose instead to escape by land. Over 40,000 Athenians survived. On September 13th, they fled their camp, leaving behind their wounded and dead. Over the next few days, they marched towards Catana, a friendly city, but were continually harassed by Syracusan cavalry and light troops. Exhausted and no way to escape, Demosthenes surrendered his 6,000 troops. Nicias' men lasted another day, but eventually they were surrounded and slaughtered. Nicias personally surrendered to Gylippus, hoping the Spartan would remember his role in the peace treaty of 421. Both Nicias and Demosthenes were put to death. The once great Athenian army was reduced to 7,000 pitiable men, held in the wretched conditions of a stone quarry. Some of the survivors were sold into slavery. The Athenians, Italians, and Greek Sicilians were left to die in the quarry. According to Thucydides, this was Athens' greatest disaster.
Their fleet, their army, everything was destroyed, and few out of many returned home. Such were the events in Sicily.
The disaster at Sicily nearly ended the war. Most of Athens' young soldiers were dead or in prison, its fleet was shattered, and her treasury was almost empty. Athens had also lost her best generals, and the one man who could lead the city, Alcibiades, had fled to Sparta. With the city in a state of shock and desperate for leadership, the Athenian assembly elected a board of 10 experienced men to run its affairs. Their first task: rebuild the fleet. Unfortunately, building dozens of ships would be very expensive, so they decided to raise capital by taxing all goods imported or exported at sea. This new tax immediately caused major dissent throughout the Delian League. In the spring of 413, King Agis of Sparta captured and fortified Decelia, causing a major panic in Athens. The fort at Decelia gave refuge to runaway slaves, stopped farmers from working their lands around Attica, and blocked the silver mines at Laurium. A year later in 412, Sparta received more good news when Euboea and Lesbos revolted against Athens, and delegations from Chios and Erythrae traveled to Sparta asking for help with their uprisings. Another unexpected surprise came when two Persian satraps, Tissaphernes of Lydia and Pharnabazus of Hellespontine, Phrygia, offered financial assistance to Sparta. The message was clear. The Ionian Revolt had begun, and the Persian Empire was ready to fight against Athens. After a long debate, the Peloponnesian League decided to send 5 ships to Chios and Erythrae, and 21 to Lesbos. The Athenians had learned of this plan, though, and sent a fleet of 37 ships to meet them at Lesbos. Still afraid to face Athenian triremes in open battle, the Peloponnesians turned back and fled to their deserted port at Spiraeum. Just as they anchored at the harbor, the Athenians caught up to them and destroyed their fleet. Devastated by the loss at Spiraeum, the Spartans were ready to recall their entire fleet, but Alcibiades persuaded them not to. Instead, he argued they send 5 ships to Ionia, with himself on board, before news of the defeat could arrive. The Spartan fleet soon arrived at Chios. When Alcibiades told its citizens that more Spartans were on the way, their island revolted. The action at Chios inspired its neighbor Erythrae to revolt, including the great city of Ephesus. The revolt even spread to Miletus, the largest and most important Greek city in Asia. At this moment, in 412, the Spartans drafted their first official treaty with King Darius II of Persia. But the treaty was costly. To receive assistance, most of the land in Greek territory once held by the empire would be restored to Persia. In other words, the Spartans were allowing the Persians to enslave much of Greece again. The terms were so embarrassing, the Spartans hid them from their allies. Losing Chios was a dangerous development, so in the summer, Athens voted to use the emergency reserve fund of 1,000 talents. The city also reassigned the ships blockading the Spartans on the coast of Spiraeum and sent them to Chios. Then sent 19 ships from the island of Samos to stop the rebellion at Miletus. Still intimidated, the Spartans refused to fight the Athenians, who then decided to turn Samos into their main naval base in the Aegean. Just as they were about to implement their plan, civil war broke out on the island. Helped by the Athenians, the poor and ordinary people of Samos rose up against the rich oligarchs. They killed 200 noblemen, exiled 40 more, and seized their lands and properties. Next, the Athenians landed at Miletus, the last major Ionian city still in revolt. Their invading force was made up of 3,500 hoplites from Athens, Argos, and local allies. Miletus was defended by 800 local hoplites, an unknown number of Spartan hoplites and Persian mercenaries, and the satrap Tissaphernes' personal cavalry. Just as the battle was about to begin, the Argives suddenly broke formation and attacked. Fighting alone, the Argives were easily pushed back and they lost 300 men. The Athenians and the rest of the allies kept in formation and carefully advanced, eventually routing the Peloponnesians and Persian mercenaries. Surrounded, the surviving Milesians, Spartans, and Persians retreated back to Miletus. All that was left for the Athenians was to wall off the city and wait for it to surrender. But as the Athenians were celebrating their victory, scouts reported a Spartan fleet of 55 ships approaching. After a long debate, the Athenians decided to leave the city and sail back to Samos. This was a crucial decision because it not only gave Miletus back to the enemy, but it allowed the Spartans to eventually take the island of Rhodes. During the winter of 412, the Spartans sailed back to the city of Iassos. For some unknown reason, the inhabitants thought the ships that were approaching belonged to the Athenian navy and decided to let the soldiers in. Taking back one of the empire's cities led to the Spartans and Persians renegotiating the first treaty. The new version dropped terms such as Greek cities in Asia belonging to the great king, making it more palatable. But back in Sparta it was rejected, which led to a third treaty in February of 411. The terms were slightly more favorable to Sparta this time. The king's country was described as Asia. They would have no claim to any lands in Greek territory such as Thrace, Macedonia, or Boeotia. The Persians also promised to deliver a new fleet to Sparta, but on one condition: the Spartans had to abandon the Greek towns of Asia. This was an embarrassing submission for the Spartans, considering their supposed role as liberators of Greece. But Athens could not be defeated without a large navy, leaving them no choice but to accept Persian financial support. So, like they had done twice before, the Spartans reluctantly agreed to their terms. With the war not progressing well, many Athenians began to question their own unique form of government: democracy. The endless conflict, the casualties, the inability to achieve victory raised doubts about a system that put common men in power and not leaders of noble birth like Pericles. And by 411, especially when Sparta began to receive help from the Persian Empire, Most Athenians were open to the idea of limiting certain democratic practices, even removing democracy itself to win the war. Adding to the confusion was Alcibiades, who, at this point, had defected to the Persian Empire. Alcibiades sent word to the Athenians that if they were willing to give up democracy, the Persians would join their side. The proposal was well received in Athens. Most citizens believed Sparta could never be defeated without external support. When enough Athenians were fed up with democracy, a coup was launched. It started when young aristocrats, recruited by the oligarchs to terrorize the city, assassinated key democratic leaders. After all opposition had been eliminated or scared into submission, on June 9th, power was handed over to a group of oligarchs called the 400. Their main goal was to end the war, make peace with Sparta, and turn Athens into a permanent oligarchy. They sent an embassy to King Aegeus of Sparta, offering a peace where both sides kept the lands they currently held. Believing the Athenians were on their knees, the king ordered an army from the Peloponnese to join up with his army from Desalia and invade Athens. As the army approached, Athenians of all classes and political backgrounds put their differences aside and joined forces. This unified army emerged from behind the city's walls, defeated the Peloponnesians, and drove them away. As the summer of 411 was winding down, the oligarchs were stunned to hear that a Spartan fleet had sailed to Euboea, a strategically important island next to Athens. The citizens of Eretria, the island's most important city, wanted to rid themselves of Athenian control. So when the Spartans occupied the harbor at Oropus with 42 ships, the Eretrians joined their side. Just when the Athenians were in their harbor with 32 ships gathering supplies, the Eretrians raised a fire signal and the Spartans attacked. The Athenians raced back to their ships, but without a chance to organize, they were driven back to shore. Anyone who fled was slaughtered. Only those who made it to the town of Chalcis, or the local Athenian fort, survived. The Athenians lost 22 ships and their crews, and most of the island joined the Peloponnesian League. The loss of Euboea sent shockwaves throughout Athens. With few ships left and no money, the Athenians put an end to the rule of the 400 and turned their affairs over to the moderate oligarchy of the 5,000. In less than a year, full democracy would be restored. Athens faced a new crisis when a large Peloponnesian fleet sailed to the important city of Byzantium. The fleet not only incited rebellion in Byzantium and nearby towns, but also jeopardized Athens' grain supply, grain the city depended on for its survival. The Athenians had no choice but to retake the strait and re-establish control over the area. By the summer of 411, the Peloponnesian fleet had sailed to its base at Abydos in the Hellespont. Since the Spartans refused to fight in the open sea, the Athenians were forced to meet them inside the narrow strait. The two fleets met with the ships positioned parallel to the coast. The Peloponnesians had 86 ships lined along the Asian side of the strait. The Athenians had 76 ships lined along the European. The Peloponnesians placed the Syracusans on the right, the Spartans at the center and the left. The game plan for both fleets was simple: force the enemy ashore and destroy them. When the Athenian fleet reached Kynosema, where the strait was most narrow, the Spartans attacked. They also tried to outflank the Athenian right so they could trap them inside the strait. But the Athenian commander spotted the trap and stretched his line to outflank the Spartan left. This weakened the Athenian center, allowing the Spartans and Syracusans to push the Athenians to the coast. But they dropped the ball when their ships began to chase the enemy, leaving their line disorganized. At that moment, the Athenians regrouped and attacked, causing them to flee. When the ships came around the bend of Kynosema, the rest of the Peloponnesian fleet panicked and sailed away to Abydos. Although the Athenians only captured 21 ships while losing 15, the victory at Kynosema saved them. Their discipline and experience overcame superior enemy manpower, and the battle once again showed why their navy was so feared. After the victory at Kynosema, the Athenian fleet established a base at Sestos to counter the Spartan base at Abydos. In early November, the Spartans ordered the Syracusan commander of 14 ships, who was putting down a rebellion at Rhodes, to join the rest of the fleet at the Hellespont. These ships sailed north, but before they could reach Abydos, they were spotted by Athenian lookouts and driven ashore, and eventually trapped at Dardanus. The main Peloponnesian fleet sailed out from Abydos to rescue these trapped ships. The main Athenian fleet sailed out as well and challenged them. The combined Spartan fleet had 97 ships, the Athenians 74. Throughout the day, the fighting was fierce and evenly matched. Suddenly, 18 ships were spotted approaching. Both fleets thought the reinforcements were theirs, but the fleet commander, Alcibiades, ran up a red flag. Realizing these were Athenian ships, the Spartan fleet fled to Abydos. The Peloponnesians defended their ships on land, with the Persian satrap Pharnabazus and his cavalry helping them. When the fighting ended, the Athenians captured 30 Spartan triremes and recovered the 15 the Spartans had taken from them at the Battle of Kynosema. By the spring of 410, the Peloponnesians had a fleet of 80 triremes, the Athenians only 40. Facing such a disadvantage, the Athenians decided to leave Sestos and sail to Cardia, where the rest of the fleet had gathered, bringing the total number of ships to 86. Meanwhile, the Peloponnesians took the town of Cyzicus, forcing the Athenians to respond. Traveling during a rainstorm to avoid detection, the Athenian fleet sailed to Artaki, where they split forces. Alcibiades took 46 ships and sailed for Cyzicus. Commander Thrasybulus took 40 ships and hid in the small harbor to the north. The Peloponnesians, seeing a much smaller fleet, attacked the Athenians. Alcibiades' force fled west, with the Peloponnesians commanded by the Spartan general Mindarus chasing them. When they had sailed deep into the harbor, Alcibiades suddenly turned and faced the enemy. At that moment, Thrasybulus emerged and surrounded the Peloponnesians. Realizing the trap, Mindarus raced to a beach called Clary, where the Persian satrap Pharnabazus had placed his Persian army. Even though the Peloponnesians pulled their triremes onto the beach, Alcibiades' men tried to pull the enemy ships back out to sea with grappling hooks. The Persians joined in and pushed back the Athenians, but Commander Thrasybulus ordered the remaining Athenians into the battle, decimating the Spartan and Persian army. By the end, all the Spartan ships were captured. The Syracusans escaped, but they burned their ships after retreating. The Athenians also took Cyzicus without a fight, and intercepted a letter from the Spartan camp which read,
"The ships are gone. Mindarus is dead. The men are starving. We know not what to do."
For a while, it seemed all was going well for Athens. They had destroyed most of the Spartan fleet, regained control of the Aegean and Black Sea, and taken hundreds of prisoners. In fact, Athens had taken so many prisoners, the Spartans were forced to think about peace. And that's exactly what happened. Demoralized by the devastation of their fleet at the Battle of Cyzicus, Sparta sent a peace embassy to Athens in the summer of 410. Their terms were simple.
Both parties would keep the territory it controlled, exchange prisoners, and surrender military garrisons residing in each other's territory.
Cleophon, a popular Athenian leader, whose father served as a general at the start of the war, was the main voice against peace. Over the course of the war, Sparta had gained a foothold in 3 territories crucial to the security of Athens: Euboea, the Hellespont, and the Bosphorus. Cleophon argued that peace could only be achieved if Sparta abandoned all 3 territories. And with the recent wins at Abydos and Cyzicus, plus the failure of the Peace of Nicias back in 421, Athens rejected Sparta's offer of peace. When the peace negotiations failed, Athenians lost faith in the 5,000 and restored democracy. Later that summer in July, Spartan king Agis again tried to take advantage of the political instability. He formed an army and attacked Athens. But like before, he was pushed back to Thessalia by a unified and fully democratic city. The Spartans received more bad news when Carthage attacked Syracuse in the summer of 409. Syracuse was forced to recall their fleet from the Aegean and Hellespont, depriving the Spartans of their best naval allies. But things were just as bad for Athens as they were for Sparta. A year earlier, civil war broke out again in Corcyra, removing one of Athens' best allies. They also lost their fort at Pylos and the island of Chios to the Spartans. With these losses, Athens was moving cautiously, waiting for the right time to attack. That time came in the summer of 409, when a fleet of 50 triremes was assembled, carrying a fighting force of 11,000 men. The fleet sailed out to the region of Ionia. It captured Colophon and raided the mainland, but was defeated trying to take the important city of Ephesus. The fleet did, however, retake Byzantium and other cities in the Hellespont in the summer of 408, giving Athens control of the Bosphorus and access to the Black Sea. These lost territories were not regained by force, but by good diplomacy, and the man most responsible was none other than Alcibiades. These victories would allow Alcibiades to return to the city that had exiled him. And that return happened in the spring of 407. Alcibiades was not only a respected general, but also a distinguished diplomat with extensive ties to the Persian Empire. Athenians knew that the key to winning the war, or at least gaining a favorable peace, was splitting the Spartan-Persian alliance, and the one man who could pull off such a feat was Alcibiades. Unsure how he would be received, Alcibiades moved carefully after docking at the port of Piraeus. But when throngs of people cheered his arrival, which grew into a hero's reception, it was obvious he was welcomed home. And after presiding over the celebration of the mysteries in Eleusis, a very prestigious event, the Athenian assembly voted to give Alcibiades command of a fleet. Made up of 100 triremes, 1,500 hoplites, and 150 cavalry, it set out in October to recover lost territories such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Chios. As Athens was celebrating the return of Alcibiades, her enemies were preparing for war. The Spartans were rebuilding their fleet, and King Darius had replaced Tissaphernes, his satrap of western Anatolia, with his youngest son, Cyrus. More importantly, the Spartans finally found a commander capable of beating Athens, Lysander. Although he came from a poor Spartan family, Lysander was intelligent, diplomatic, and above all, very ambitious. Lysander quickly gained Cyrus's trust. In fact, the young prince was so impressed with Lysander, he gave the Spartan unlimited funds to build a powerful fleet. When the Athenian assembly heard of this new coalition, they had no choice but to force a naval battle. A victory would not only give Athens full control of the Aegean, but force Sparta to sue for peace. Having established a base at Ephesus, Lysander grew his fleet to 90 triremes. In 406, Alcibiades arrived at Notium with 80 triremes. He tried to engage the Spartans, but Lysander, showing great patience, refused to fight. Forced to do something that would make Lysander fight, Alcibiades took a few ships and joined Thrasybulus, who was attacking Phocea, leaving behind his helmsman Antiochus in charge of the remaining fleet. This was the turning point of the battle. Antiochus was a brave soldier, but inexperienced, and even though Alcibiades gave him one simple order,
"Do not attack Lysander's ships,"
as soon as he sailed away, Antiochus attacked Lysander's ships. Inspired by success at the Battle of Cyzicus, Antiochus wanted to bait the enemy towards Notium, then have the rest of the fleet come out and surround them. But unlike Cyzicus, Lysander knew the size of the Athenian fleet. He also knew Alcibiades was away, and an inexperienced man was left in charge. So when Antiochus personally led 10 triremes out into the open water, Lysander charged at the lead ship with 3 triremes of his own, sinking it and killing Antiochus. The 9 remaining ships fled back to their base, with the entire Spartan fleet in hot pursuit. With Antiochus dead and unsure what to do, Athenian ships sailed out completely disorganized. The Spartans immediately attacked. They sunk or took 22 ships while losing none. 3 days later, Alcibiades returned to Notium along with Thrasybulus' 30 triremes, but it was too late. The victory gave the Spartans momentum. Athenian morale was low, and deserters began to increase. Alcibiades tried to save face by attacking the city of Cyme, but was stopped and forced to retreat. When news of the disaster in Notium reached Athens, the personal attacks against Alcibiades began again. Ambassadors from Cyme accused him of attacking an allied city that had done no wrong, while others claimed he was collaborating with the enemy to betray the city. In the end, Alcibiades was voted out of office and command of the fleet was given to Conon, a respected general. Alcibiades went into exile again, and with Sparta and Persia off limits, he retired to a castle on the Gallipoli Peninsula. As for the Spartans, they too had a new fleet commander, Callicratidas. Feeling the pressure to live up to his popular predecessor, Callicratidas immediately challenged Conon to a sea battle. He even told Conon that he meant to stop Athens'
adulterous affair with the sea.
With 170 ships manned by excellent crews, Callicratidas intercepted Conon's fleet of 70 ships and forced them to retreat to Lesbos. The two fleets met by the entrance to the harbor. The Athenians fought well, but they were overwhelmed, losing 30 triremes and forcing the remaining 40 to land on the beach. The Spartans quickly bottled up the harbor and placed troops around them. Surrounded by land and sea and threatened to starvation, Conon barely slipped a messenger ship out to Athens. The ship made it to Athens in the middle of June 406. The Athenians moved quickly, and within a month of receiving the news, they were able to build their fleet from 40 to 110 ships. Their new makeshift fleet sailed to Samos in July, where they picked up another 45 triremes, bringing the total number to 155. Not wanting to be caught between two fleets, the Spartans left 50 ships behind to block Conon, then sailed out to meet the incoming ships. The Athenians had docked off the Arginusae Islands, 2 miles away from Lesbos. At daybreak, the Spartans sailed out to Arginusae. They placed their ships in a straight line, 120 side by side, with crews trained to use Athens' very own tactics, the periplus and dikplus. To counter this, the Athenians came up with a unique plan. They put their ships in 3 groups, 2 wings and the center. The center had 35 triremes lined in a standard formation, but each wing had 60 ships, 2 lines deep, with each ship in the rear line filling a gap between the ships on the front row. The Athenians also doubled the size of the gap between the triremes, with the triremes in the rear line stopping a potential dikplus. This gave them a longer line to outflank the enemy. Their final innovation was dividing their wings into 8 units, each under its own general, giving the fleet more flexibility. Still confident in their naval superiority, the Athenians took the initiative and attacked. As they advanced, they extended their left wing to try and outflank the Spartans. This created a dangerous situation. Callicratidas, who personally led Sparta's right, was advised to retreat, but he decided to split his fleet in half to block the encirclement. Both sides fought hard, but when Callicratidas was killed, the entire Spartan right collapsed. The Spartan left continued to resist until the Athenian center, which until now had been on standby, joined in and attacked. Eventually, the Spartan left was overwhelmed and forced to flee. And when the commander of Mytilenean heard of the outcome, he also sailed away, allowing Conon to join the main fleet. All told, the Spartans lost 70 ships and the Athenians 25. At the time, the Battle of Arginusae was the largest naval battle ever fought between Greeks. It was a crucial win for the Athenians. Losing would have led to their total defeat. But for the Athenian generals, the battle had not ended. When the Spartan fleet sailed away, they turned their attention to the survivors of the ships that had been sunk or disabled. Thousands of men were desperately clinging to the wreckage of their ships. The generals tried to rescue them, but were stopped by an unexpected storm and forced to sail away. Most of these men would eventually die. Initially, Athenians were overjoyed with the surprise victory, but when news of the abandoned survivors reached home, they grew furious with the generals. The question of how they should be tried was brought before the assembly. At first it seemed the generals would be exonerated, but when the loss of the drowned men finally sunk in, anger and frustration took hold. A vote was taken, and all 6 generals were found guilty and executed, including Pericles the Younger, son of the famous Athenian statesman. By the winter of 406, the Spartans were ready to discuss peace again. The recent defeats, the poor condition of their fleet, and the potential return of Lysander, who would continue the war, forced them to send an embassy to Athens. The terms were simple. The fort at Desilia would be surrendered, and each side would keep the territories it held. To the shock of the entire Greek world, the Athenian assembly again rejected Sparta's peace offer, and the man behind it was none other than Cleophon. Again. Unfortunately, most Athenians did not trust the Spartans, especially not after their breach of faith during the Peace of Nicias. Experience had taught them that the Spartans would rebuild their fleet, regroup their forces, and then resume the war. Since the Battle of Arginusae, Sparta's allies in the Aegean and Asian mainland had been suffering from Athenian attacks. So in the spring of 405, they petitioned the Spartans to reinstate Lysander. Even though it was unconstitutional and many opposed it, Sparta reinstated him. Lysander received more good news when Cyrus, his powerful Persian ally, was summoned to the royal court and temporarily appointed him satrap during his absence, an unprecedented honor. After rebuilding his fleet at Ephesus to nearly 200 ships, Lysander moved to eliminate anyone who could threaten his authority. His first target was Miletus. Although Miletus was a democratic city loyal to Sparta, he killed 340 democratic supporters and drove another 1,000 away from the city. Democracy was abolished, and an oligarchy loyal to him and not Sparta was installed. Next, Lysander sailed to the territory of Caria and the island of Rhodes. Continuing his policy of terror, any cities allied to Athens were attacked. The men were killed and the women and children sold into slavery. Lysander then sailed to Sparta's base at Abydos, gathered an army, and then attacked Lampsacus. With their key cities of Byzantium and Chalcedon under threat, as well as their trade with the Black Sea, Athens was forced to respond. The Athenians sailed for their base at Sestos, then moved up to an area called Aegospotami, across from the Spartan fleet of 170 ships docked at Lampsacus. Aegospotami, though, was essentially a large beach, not an ideal spot to land 180 ships with 36,000 men looking for supplies. For 4 consecutive days, the Athenian fleet sailed out to Lampsacus in battle formation, waiting to fight. When Lysander refused to emerge, the fleet sailed back to Aegospotami. Then, like a famous actor making a cameo, Alcibiades appeared. Living nearby and watching the events unfold, he approached the Athenian camp and offered his help, which included the support of the Thracian army. All they wanted in return was a share of the command. Having lost all credibility, though, the generals rejected Alcibiades' offer and told him to leave. On the 5th day, the Athenian fleet sailed out to Lampsacus, and, like usual, when Lysander refused to fight, it sailed back to Aegospotami. When the fleet returned to camp, the sailors left their ships and went out looking for food. At that precise moment, the Spartan fleet sailed across from Lampsacus and landed on the beach. Lysander placed an army on land while the ships hauled away the enemy ships. Unable to mount a resistance, most Athenian soldiers fled, allowing the fleet to be destroyed. Only 9 ships escaped. The rest were captured along with thousands of soldiers. Led by General Conon, the 9 ships that did escape found refuge at Cyprus. All Athenian soldiers, more than 3,000 men, were executed. With the treasury empty and unable to rebuild the fleet, the war was almost over. Lysander's fleet slowly moved towards Athens, capturing cities along the way, the Athenians powerless to stop him. When news of his approaching arrival reached Athens, terror gripped the entire city. Everyone remembered how poorly they had treated conquered enemies, like the Melians and Aeginetans, and now they worried the same would happen to them. In October 405, Lysander sailed to Athens and joined up with both Spartan kings, Agis, who had marched his army from Desilia, and Pausanias, who arrived with his army from the Peloponnese. With the port of Piraeus blocked and 2 large armies at their walls, Athens was surrounded and unable to import food supplies. During the winter, naval commander Theramenes traveled to Sparta and conducted negotiations. The Spartans held an assembly of all Peloponnesian allies. The Corinthians and Thebans wanted Athens destroyed, but the Spartans refused them. Instead, they offered the following terms of surrender.
The long walls and the fortifications of Piraeus must be destroyed. All ships except 12 surrendered, the exiles to be recalled. Athens to have the same enemies and the same friends as Sparta, and to follow Spartan leadership in any expedition Sparta might make either by land or sea.
Considering the length of the war and the devastation it brought to the entire Greek world, Sparta's terms were lenient. Theramenes returned to Athens and pushed the assembly to surrender. Cleophon and other Democrats argued against it, but with people dying of hunger, the majority accepted the terms of surrender. In April 404, Lysander sailed into Piraeus. The exiled oligarchs returned home, and democracy was abolished and replaced with an oligarchy. According to Xenophon,
The Peloponnesians, with great enthusiasm, began to tear down the walls to the music of flute girls, thinking that that day was the beginning of freedom for Greece.
To everyone's surprise, Athens was spared destruction. Perhaps they feared a powerful Thebes, or they wanted a buffer against the Persians. Whatever the reason, Sparta treated its old enemy lightly. The Delian League was disbanded though, and Athens was forced to join the Peloponnesian League. Democracy also came to an end. Power was handed to a group of 30 oligarchs, and all opposition, including Cleophon and his allies, were jailed or executed. This new regime grew so oppressive, it eventually earned the name the 30 Tyrants. Little changed for the so-called liberated cities of the old Athenian Empire. Other than replacing democracies with oligarchies, the Spartans collected taxes and ruled by fear. In other words, they replaced the previous empire with their own. Sparta now ruled the Greek world. As for Lysander, he not only became a hero, he achieved godlike status when cities raised altars and made sacrifices to him. Another first in Greek history. But Lysander set a terrible precedent. Wealth poured into Sparta for the first time, corrupting her leaders and changing the city forever. Back in Athens, the rule of the 30 tyrants was about to end. First, a group of angry Democrats, led by Thrasybulus, fled to Thebes. Then, when enough citizens had escaped and joined him, Thrasybulus formed an army and marched back to Athens. This new democratic army captured the port of Piraeus and fought the Spartans to a draw. Unwilling and unable to fight another long war, the Spartans abandoned Athens, and full democracy was restored. The costs of the Peloponnesian War were enormous. Entire populations, like the island of Melos, were wiped out or sold into slavery, and time-honored religious and military traditions were cast aside, all in the name of victory. According to Thucydides, a love of power, operating through greed and personal ambition, was the cause of all these evils. And with much of the Greek world devastated, men had no choice but to become mercenaries. The most famous being the 10,000, led by Xenophon, who supported Cyrus in his attempt to overthrow his brother Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Back in 431, King Archidamus of Sparta predicted the war would last long enough to leave to their children. He was correct. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years, and it was a hatred of opposing peoples, ideologies, and ways of life that led to it. Our modern society is no better. The hatred between liberals and conservatives, or woke versus anti-woke, is so great we too could find ourselves in a long and destructive war one day.